Introduction to Philosophy, Lecture 8, on Metaphysics and Epistemology. Chapter 8 in our text continues the unit on personal identity and the mind-body problem with an interesting bit of science fiction entitled This Above All. This short story is much more appropriate for this section than the story about a car's moral settings was in the first unit on skepticism, because this story actually has to do with the mind-body problem and personal identity. However, the car's moral setting story ended up being beneficial because it gave us an opportunity to compare metaphysical questions to epistemological questions and to ethical questions, and sometimes it's difficult to be able to distinguish between those. This, above all, is a story about Greg and Alan. Greg is unfortunately in some kind of accident that renders a third of his brain useless or destroyed. Alan happens to have been working on cutting-edge medical technology that kind of combines recent developments in brain transplantation and mind downloading. In the story, brain transplants had been conducted successfully, but mind downloading hadn't been. Every attempt thus far to download a mind into a conventional computer only succeeded in capturing some memories, but there was no apparent functional consciousness. And what's the human consciousness to do when downloaded into a computer anyway? One of the key elements of mind downloading that dissuaded most from attempting it further was the fact that, as our text says, upon downloading a mind to a computer, it fries the organic brain. Alan's treatment differed from these in a couple of ways. The downloading process that Alan has in mind wouldn't be to a traditional computer, but to a synthetic brain. Once the mind is downloaded into the synthetic brain, the brain can be implanted back into the patient in the same way that successful brain transplants had been conducted in the recent years in this story. The idea being that the synthetic brain, possessed of all of the memories and capabilities of an organic brain, should be able to carry the consciousness to be able to control the body and continue the life after the death of the organic brain. Until now, the only thing that had gotten in Alan's way is the fact that people don't want to volunteer for these types of procedures because historically they haven't been successful and it fries the brain in the process. However, Greg is the exact type of patient that this very process would be developed for. Someone that has a working body but a damaged brain. Alan and Greg are both aware that Greg's brain isn't healing the way it's supposed to, and that if left untreated, Greg is going to die anyway. Alan knows that since he has history with Greg and a foundation of trust already developed, he has a good chance of getting Greg to agree to the procedure. Furthermore, Greg knows that this is his only chance to persist in life in any meaningful way, even if it does mean that his organic brain is fried in the process. Perhaps if the procedure is successful, then a part of him will still exist in the world and will still be able to have a positive impact and giving his life meaning. So Greg agrees to the treatment. They go through the procedure, and the story leaves us on a cliffhanger of Greg waking up and Alan asking him, "Greg, can you hear me?" This story alludes to some philosophical concepts, ideas of identity persistence, such as the biological continuity approach, or the BCA, and the psychological continuity approach, the PCA. This procedure would be appealing to someone that endorsed the biological continuity approach because, say, more than 90% of the organic being of the person is still intact and still living in the world. The biological continuity approach to identity persistence basically holds that there are no special psychological states or capacities that are necessary for our persistence, since we were all at one time existing as a fetus before we had any personhood dependent psychology. And as we grow older, on this view, we still retain our personal identity, even if we start to suffer cognitive decline in states of dementia and so forth. However, from this point of view, it could still be objected that since the biological continuity of the brain is interrupted, it is still problematic. However, from the perspective of the PCA, the psychological continuity approach, because the organic brain is going to be fried during the download, this is going to constitute a termination of personal identity. Unless, of course, in this procedure, there is actually a transfer of consciousness, which seems quite unlikely. It appears to be more of a copying of consciousness and memories, so that Greg 1 will be terminated in the download process, and then Greg 2 will wake up after surgery thinking that with the impression that nothing had happened and life is just continuing. But even though Greg 2 will have the psychology of Greg 1 and think that he is Greg 1, he's actually Greg 2. This problem relates to another problem, known as the problem of other minds. Since we can interact with people, have discussions with them, and come to the conclusion that they have a mind like we do, that they experience the world in a similar way, and that they have thoughts, but for all we know, they could be cleverly disguised robots that are just interacting with us in a way to make us think that there are other people. I could be the only person, and everyone else is just some type of metaphysical puppet. So since we can't really know if other people have minds, then we really wouldn't know if there was a transfer in consciousness for Greg from his organic brain to the synthetic brain. We could ask him, but we'd have to really take his word for it, just like we have to take everyone else's word for it. So it seems more likely that this would be a copy, and it would be Greg 2, not Greg 1. Even though this is a piece of science fiction, these approaches to identity persistence and personal identity actually do have real-world implications. For example, if you endorse a biological continuity approach to identity persistence, then you could, as some do, argue against the moral permissibility of abortion. The reason being, on this view, psychological states or capacities aren't important for determining whether or not an organic life is a person. So, since the fetus is genetically unique, it has its own personal identity. From the psychological continuity approach to personal identity and identity persistence, one could argue for the permissibility of abortion, stating that there is no personhood-dependent psychology present, so it's not yet a person. It doesn't have personal identity. However, the PCA has further implications. Because personhood, or personal identity, and persistence depend on psychological continuity and personhood-dependent psychological states, that means that it opens up the door for arguments for the moral permissibility of euthanasia, say for example in cases of persistent vegetative states. There are still other metaphysical questions that arise from this thought experiment and variations of it. For example, if a person with a damaged occipital lobe could get a synthetic occipital lobe replacement, and the only difference the patient notices is a return of lost eyesight and feels completely normal, our intuitions would typically be that the operation was a success. This would seem to mean that it doesn't matter what kind of stuff our brains are made of, so long as they continue to function normally. However, what if, as a person aged, they had more and more partial brain replacements until eventually, like the ship of Theseus we discussed last lecture, the brain became fully replaced with synthetic brain matter? Would we still have the same intuition that this was still the same person? Even if we appeared to have undisrupted psychological states, it still isn't perfectly clear.